You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Morning decisions. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel, maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
Pretty early on in the first year of producing this podcast, before I really discovered my zeal for rational skepticism, I tried my hand at telling some spooky ghost stories from European folklore. I started by telling the story of the Weiße Frau, the White Lady of the Old Schloss, which corresponded with numerous other legends of female spirits that appeared in gossamer white dresses in other German palaces, whose appearance was always said to presage some disaster, and whose origins I traced back to Norse mythology and even connected to the ubiquitous folklore surrounding Santa Claus. Then, in a follow-up episode on so-called tutelary spirits, I explored the many other European stories about strange beings encountered by royalty as an omen of imminent catastrophe. From the ancient Greek daemon to the Roman genius, these protective and guiding spirits were said to attach themselves to places and families. And from the white, black, and red lady spirits of numerous cultures to the ghostly white tern-falcon birds, said to only appear in augury of some dark turn of fate for the Habsburgs, most have been associated with royalty. And as I recently started to read about another famous story of ghostly encounters on the grounds of a palace, one story in particular was brought to mind, that of Le Petit Homme Rouge de Tuileries, the Little Red Man or Red Spectre of Tuileries Palace. This small, demonic-looking man with beady eyes, dressed all in scarlet, sometimes described as red-faced and cloven-hoofed like a little devil, other times as hunchbacked, hook-nosed, and one-eyed, was said to appear to French royalty in Tuileries Palace. His legend goes back to Catherine Medici, who had the palace built for herself as a new home. One version of the story is that the Red Man was the spirit of a henchman of hers, whom she had had assassinated on the grounds, while another version simply has it that the apparition was already inhabiting the new palace as soon as she moved in. It's said that the Red Man predicted she would die, quote, near Saint Germain, end quote, and believing that this meant the nearby Saint Germain church, the Queen abandoned her new home. Decades later, as she lay dying, she realized with great irony that the clerk administering her last rites was named Saint Germain, so there had never been any reason to abandon her beloved palace. In reality, other versions of this story omit the Red Man altogether, suggesting the Queen's astrologer delivered this prophecy. But the legend of the Red Man of Tuileries would live on. In the early days of 1792, days before revolutionaries stormed the palace and the French Revolution commenced, it's said that the Red Man appeared to Marie Antoinette or to her attendants, thus commencing a long tradition of delivering an evil omen. It was said that the Red Man appeared to Napoleon Bonaparte and foretold military defeats, acting as his de facto military advisor, or that his appearance foreshadowed the Emperor's 1814 abdication. As was the case with the White Ladies in Germany, some sightings were known hoaxes, as when some 1815 sightings in the Louvre, very near the Tuileries, were found to be pranks perpetrated by young art students who were dressing in red and climbing through chimneys to scare everyone. But L'Homme Rouge supposedly appeared again before the death of Louis XVIII in 1824, and again in 1871, presaging the fires of Paris during the Bloody Week of the Commune. And still, the legend of the Red Man didn't die, but was carried to America, where in the 1880s, stories began to be told of the Nain Rouge, or Red Dwarf, in Detroit, Michigan, whose appearances always presaged disasters. And though the stories had never been told at the time, the myth was extended back with claims that the Nain Rouge was responsible for Detroit's surrender in the War of 1812, as well as the carnage of the Battle of Bloody Run, where legend has it the Red Dwarf danced among the corpses. None of these stories should be taken very seriously. They can all be simply explained as folklore, superstitious legends that arise from any number of mundane origins, are perpetuated through repetition and embellishment, are enlivened through lies and hoaxes, and take on a life of their own, proliferating endlessly. What drew my attention back to the story of the Red Man of the Tuileries is that there exists another story, a ghost story, or perhaps more of a time travel story, and this one can be taken more seriously, told as it was by two reputable women of academic background who afterward carefully undertook an investigation to prove that their seemingly supernatural experience was indeed a genuine, unexplained phenomenon. And they too describe an encounter with Marie Antoinette on the grounds of a palace just before the insurrection of 10 August 1792. Their names were Moberly and Jourdain, and their story, as related in their 1911 bestseller, An Adventure, written under pen names, described their encounter 10 years earlier as either a brush with the spirits of the dead, a visitation to the past, or a sojourn into the mind and memory of the last Queen of France. And their claims are the best and most undeniable proof of supernatural phenomena ever provided. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and April Fools. Their story is nothing of the sort. Some may have claimed that their story was strong evidence of anomalous phenomena, but most just see it as a shared delusion or an honest mistake. Thank you for listening to Versailles Time Slip, the Moberly-Jourdain Incident. Before we begin, I want to thank my newest patron, Stinky. Thanks to all my patrons. I love researching and writing this program. I'm proud of it, and I find it fulfilling. But it's still the financial support of you patrons, far more than the meager ad revenue I bring in, that makes it possible for me to devote as much time as I do to the podcast. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long. And they tie in with the main episode topics. And they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. For example, after my episode on Hypatia, I released one about the Roman persecution of Christians being largely a myth. And after my episode on transgender experience in Weimar, Germany, I released an episode about some famous transgender advocates who were outed in the American press, Christine Jorgensen and Renee Richards. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. And just to reiterate, my assertion that the story I'll be relating in this episode is strong evidence for the supernatural was only a little April Fool's jape, which will only be well-timed for the teaser I released to patrons on March 31st. I explained previously in my episode on the Rosenheim poltergeist that I approach stories of ghost encounters skeptically, but also with an open mind, treating them more like visionary experience, but also scrutinizing for indications of confirmation bias or hoax, leery because of the fact that though stories of ghosts have been told throughout human history, no hard scientific evidence for their existence has ever been collected. I approach this story the same way, though it is sometimes viewed more as a time travel claim than a haunting, and I find far more reason to doubt than to believe. That said, let us embark on this adventure with Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain to the Palace of Versailles. It was 1901. Moberly was a 55-year-old woman and principal of St. Hugh's Hall, a burgeoning new ladies' college at Oxford. Jourdain was a 38-year-old headmistress of a girls' school in Paris, whom Moberly had traveled to meet, as she would soon take on the position of vice principal at St. Hugh's. Neither woman had ever married, and both had devoted themselves to their careers as educators. They toured Paris during Moberly's visit, and eventually came around to Versailles, though they claimed to have no interest in or knowledge of the palace. Finding the palace itself rather dull, they wandered its grounds and gardens, ending up near the Petit Trianon, a little chateau originally built for Louis XV's chief mistress and later given to Marie Antoinette by Louis XVI. What happened next is not entirely clear, since the two women did not remark on it at the time and only later discussed what they had seen. According to their story, as they later settled it, they began to see people dressed in anachronistic historical garb. Then, as they entered a wooded glade, they felt a strange and oppressive emotional atmosphere and perceived an unusual artificiality in their surroundings, calling it quote-unquote flat and comparing it to a picture in a tapestry. They saw a garden kiosk, encountered a strange and repulsive pockmarked man who gave them an unpleasant look, then another who was more of a gentleman and redirected them, saying in a strangely accented French, quote, "You shouldn't go that way, look for the house over here," end quote. They then crossed a bridge and encountered a woman in a terrace sketching. Afterward, they ran into a wedding party and seemed to be back in what they considered normal surroundings with modern French people and tourists. Neither spoke of the experience, but 3 months later, it came out that Jourdain had not seen the sketching woman under the terrace. So the idea entered their minds that the palace was haunted and they had seen ghosts. They resolved to write their recollections separately and compare them in order to ascertain what spirit one might have seen that the other did not. The result of their note comparison was the revelation that both had felt something strange had happened to them, and both had seen different figures. One had seen a woman shaking out a cloth, the other hadn't. Jourdain had seen what appeared to her to be gardeners, while Moberly had seen, quote, very dignified officials, end quote. Jourdain saw a woman handing a jug to a little girl in the doorway of a cottage, describing it as a, quote, tableau vivant, end quote, or living scene, like a wax museum display. But Moberly saw nothing of the sort. The sinister-looking pockmarked fellow had also only been seen by one of them, and of course, only one of them had seen the sketching woman. Rather than chalk this up to spotty memory or the possibility that they had just been paying attention to different things or not really paying much attention at all, the women instead began to develop a theory that they had experienced something supernatural. While the incident has sometimes been viewed as a haunting and sometimes as a time slip, an inexplicable sudden shift in one's surroundings such that one finds themselves temporarily in another time period, that is not what Moberly and Jourdain came to believe. Looking into the matter further, they realized that they had been at the palace on the 10th of August, the 109th anniversary of the siege of another palace, the Tuileries, about which I spoke in the beginning, the terrible event that the appearance of the Little Red Man had supposedly foretold. When the palace was stormed, the guards slaughtered, and the royal family taken prisoner. Supposedly, Jourdain asked a French friend if she'd ever heard of the Petit Trianon being haunted, and was told that indeed it was, but only on a certain day in August, when the spirit of Marie Antoinette and her attendants were seen. They came to believe that the sketching woman was Marie Antoinette, encouraged by a resemblance in portraits, but they could not understand why her spirit would haunt Versailles on that particular day, when that was the day she was at Tuileries. Becoming obsessed, Jourdain returned the next year to visit the palace and was unable to find the garden kiosk or the bridge they'd crossed. And even on this visit, she claimed to see disappearing figures, to feel phantom fabric swishing past her, and to hear snatches of antique music on the air. On that trip, Jourdain found what she believed was the solution to their puzzle. She learned that October 5th, 1789, had been Marie Antoinette's last day at the Trianon, and on that day, she had been in the garden when news was given to her of the Women's March on the palace. This explained the sense of oppression they felt, as the palace had been literally under siege that day. But it did not explain why this haunting or time slip would occur on the anniversary of the sacking of the Tuileries, a completely separate event years afterward. So fixed was she on the importance of this date, the only date when supposedly the Trianon was haunted by Marie Antoinette, that she concocted a convoluted explanation that on August 10th, 1792, when the Tuileries was stormed and Marie Antoinette captured, as she sat a prisoner in the Hall of Assembly, she must have thought back to that day 3 years and 10 months earlier, when she had heard about the marchers coming to Versailles. Therefore, Jourdain reasoned, and apparently Moberly agreed, they had not so much encountered spirits or entered the past, but rather entered the very mindscape of the last Queen of France. If that sounds far-fetched, that's because it is. And that is exactly what the Society for Psychical Research thought when the two women wrote to them about their experience. This is the organization that I discussed in my episode on the Rosenheim poltergeist, which was sometimes skeptical and sometimes quite credulous. In this case, they tended towards skepticism, pointing out that Moberly and Jourdain didn't actually have any evidence of anything warranting investigation. Of course, what the society likely recognized was that no matter what research one might do in such a case, it all hinged on the subjective perceptions described by the ladies, and therefore could always be dismissed as a hoax. But Moberly and Jourdain don't appear to have accepted that. Instead, they took it as encouragement, or rather as a challenge, to compile better evidence, which they did over the course of the next decade. They visited the palace over and over, interviewed everyone they could, buried themselves in archival research, and by 1911, they believed they had their proof. The result was their book, An Adventure, which they published under the pseudonyms Miss Morrison and Miss Lamont. In it, they described their experience, their later revelations, and finally their exhaustive research. But the evidence they uncovered all had the same fatal flaw. It relied on crediting that they were accurately remembering what they'd seen and were not embellishing their recollections. For example, they confirmed that a certain plow they'd seen was only in use back then, but one had to believe that they had actually seen that plow and were otherwise unfamiliar with it. They confirmed that the buckled shoes they'd seen people wearing were only common back in the late 18th century. But again, one had to just trust that they had seen, remarked, and perfectly remembered the shoes of those they claimed to have encountered that day. They found evidence that Marie Antoinette's guards wore green, so those gardeners/dignified officials must actually have been guards. They dug up old maps and insisted that the kiosk and bridge they'd encountered and the cottage out of which the woman had handed a jug to a child could be seen on the maps but no longer existed. Still, it all hinged on their reminiscence, which was never published until years after they had done this research and stalked the grounds of the palace over and over and worked out their story precisely. Their interviews confirmed things like a door they'd heard being slammed shut actually hadn't been opened for many years, but again, they'd no evidence of actually witnessing it being open. They pored over portraits, insisting that the sketching lady that only one of them had seen was Marie Antoinette, and the sinister pockmarked man only one of them had seen was actually the Count of Vaudreuil, Joseph Hyacinthe François de Paul de Rigaud, the friend and perhaps lover of Marie Antoinette's best friend. Though as far as I can tell, that count left France after the storming of the Bastille in July of 1789, months before the Women's March on Versailles that Moberly and Jourdain pinpointed as the memory they'd entered. Needless to say, there was ample reason to dismiss an adventure, but it was a bestseller, and many viewed it as certain proof that the women had experienced something science could not explain. One reason for their story being taken as credible is certainly the extent of the research they completed. In fact, after skeptics and critics began to pick apart their claims, they published newer editions complete with an appendix offering rebuttals of skeptical arguments. It was pretty apparent that the authors had some academic background. When their true identities were finally revealed in 1931, and it did indeed turn out that the authors had some academic bona fides, their credibility ended up serving as one of the major arguments in favor of the credibility of their claims. We see arguments like these all the time when it comes to supposed witnesses of the supernatural, who are often touted as stand-up people who wouldn't lie, or as educated people who must therefore be better, more trustworthy witnesses than others. The problem with this is that even very honest and educated people can be mistaken too, for they are just as human as anyone. And often, though they may be educated, their education may have nothing to do with their ability to discern what they have seen. Very brilliant people can also experience mental illness, and being highly educated in English literature, for example, wouldn't make one more reliable as a witness of UFOs. Often this is an appeal to a false authority, and this may be the case here. For example, Charlotte Ann Moberly was the principal of a college at Oxford, but hers was not an academic position. When Elizabeth Wordsworth founded the first ladies' colleges at Oxford, she envisioned them more as finishing schools, meant to prepare women for marriage and domesticity rather than rigorous academics. The colleges became far more than that, but when she founded St. Hugh's, it was as a less expensive alternative to her other ladies' college, Lady Margaret Hall, intended for women of poorer classes. And when she appointed Charlotte Ann Moberly, it was not an academic position. She had no formal education. Rather, she had been tutored at home, which was common of women before the age of women's colleges. She was essentially hired as a house mother, and with her religious background, her contribution to the education of the young ladies in her charge was to deliver regular sermons. She had never published anything before an adventure, and afterward only published treatises on prayer and the prophets. Her last publication was about the visions of the Revelation, which suggests that her only relevant expertise would have been her familiarity with visionary or hallucinatory experience. Eleanor Jourdain, on the other hand, had received a formal education at Lady Margaret Hall. She was, in fact, the first woman to undergo oral examination in defense of a thesis and earn a doctorate in modern history at an Oxford college. She succeeded Moberly as the head of St. Hugh's, and certainly she can be argued to have possessed scholarly credibility. Among her publications are several on dramatic theory and on the works of Dante, which certainly doesn't show any expertise in anything relevant to her purported experiences. but she did write a very interesting study on theories of the infinite, published the same year as An Adventure, in which she discussed cutting-edge ideas related to time and space, and even the notion of multiple worlds or alternate realities. She was far from an expert on such theories, though, and her interest in them raises some further questions. Was this interest just a reflection of her obsession with a perceived time slip experience over the preceding decade, or had the interest preceded her claims? In which case we may ask whether they may have influenced her to dream up a fantastical explanation for what was otherwise a rather mundane incident. Regardless, some further aspects of Jourdain's character may give us pause when deciding her credibility. First, she was said to be a dominant personality, and therefore may perhaps have been the driver of the claims. It should be remembered that of the two, it was Jourdain who claimed to have heard the rumor about the Trianon's haunting from an anonymous quote-unquote French friend, and it was she who returned to the palace the following year and made further claims about hearing ghostly music and feeling the brush of spirits passing her. Even her initial claims of having no real knowledge or interest in the palace before their first visit don't really ring true, since she held an advanced degree in history, was a Francophile, had been living in Paris for years, and taught French at St. Hugh's when she began there as vice principal. For her to say she knew nothing of the history of the palace around the time of the Revolution before her subsequent research seems dubious. And finally, as principal, she's remembered as an autocrat, further developing the idea that in her relationship with Moberly, she might have bowled over the other woman and actually convinced her of the idea that they had experienced something strange together. To illustrate, in 1923, she fired a tutor who she believed had challenged her authority, leading to mass resignations by faculty and counselors and a boycott by other tutors, resulting finally in Jourdain's own resignation, soon after which she passed away from heart troubles.
Now for a brief intermission.
You tell yourself no one wants your college-era band tees, but on Depop, people are searching for exactly what you've got. You once paid a small fortune for them at merch stands. Now, a teenager who calls them vintage will offer that same small fortune back. Sell them easily on Depop. Just snap a few photos and we'll take care of the rest. Who knew your questionable music taste would be a money-making machine? Your style can make you cash. Start selling on Depop, where taste recognizes taste.
K-pop Demon Hunters, Haja Boys breakfast meal and Huntrix meal have just dropped at McDonald's. They're calling this a battle for the fans. What do you say to that, Rumi?
It's not a battle. So glad the Saja Boys could take breakfast and give our meal the rest of the day.
It is an honor to share.
No, it's our honor.
It is our larger honor.
No, really. Stop.
You can really feel the respect in this battle. Pick a meal to pick a side.
At participating McDonald's while supplies last.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. You know those friends who support your preference for podcasts over music on road trips? That's the energy State Farm brings to insurance. With over 19,000 local agents, they help you find the coverage that fits your needs, so you can spend less time worrying about insurance and more time enjoying the ride. Download the State Farm app or go online at statefarm.com. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
Now, back to the show.
I am uncomfortable offering such critical evaluations of these women's characters, since they were impressive pioneers for women's education, and in Jourdain's case also a strong proponent of women's suffrage. However, the facts of their biographies do paint the picture of, in Moberly's case, someone fascinated by the notion of unexplainable visionary experience, and in Jourdain's case, someone interested in metaphysics and theories of time, as made clear in her 1911 publication, quote, On the Theory of the Infinite in Modern Thought, end quote. And Jourdain was someone overbearing enough that she might have convinced Moberly that they themselves had experienced something supernatural. Skeptics will point to their very belief that they experienced a time slip or psychic journey as clear evidence of their unreliability. But if one credits their claims, the claims themselves cannot be used to discredit them. However, if it could be shown that this was part of a pattern of behavior, perhaps we could demonstrate a clear credibility problem. As it turns out, Moberly was prone to visions, and Jourdain to paranoia. As a child, Moberly had been fascinated by Winchester Cathedral. She believed she heard the strange words, quote, "pinnacled reality," end quote, in her ear while staring up at the spires. And when her father, a bishop, passed away, she believed she had seen strange white birds flying over the cathedral, much like the turnfalcon spirits I mentioned before. After the publication of An Adventure, she seemed to see people out of historical time more and more frequently. She believed she had seen medieval monks at Cambridge in 1913 and was certain she saw the towering figure of Charlemagne, or perhaps Constantine, at the Louvre in 1914. Meanwhile, Jourdain, who also reported strange experiences on her return visits to Versailles, showed her paranoia in several ways. During the First World War, she came to suspect that a German spy was hiding out somewhere at St. Hugh's, and took it upon herself to root them out. And during the scandal over her termination of the Tudor, she felt everyone was plotting against her. These further facts paint a convincing picture that Moberly may have hallucinated, as she was apparently known to do, or mistaken some people they actually encountered for people from another time. And Jourdain may have seized on her reports in a paranoid episode, becoming certain that there was more to it than there actually was, and with her dominant personality, may have convinced Moberly of a weird metaphysical explanation for the incidents. The simple fact that they ended their book with a chapter called A Reverie, a piece of narrative fiction imagining their encounter from Marie Antoinette's point of view, further demonstrates that no matter how convincing the veneer of academic research was that they cloaked their story in, it was at its heart a piece of fiction. The skeptical response was immediate. Eleanor Sidgwick, a physics researcher, an active member of the Society for Psychical Research, and herself an advocate for women's education, wrote a scathing review of their book, asserting that the two women were simply mistaken. They had been lost on the palace grounds, which they admitted themselves, and the landmarks they later claimed to be unable to find, the kiosk and the rustic bridge, which they claimed existed only in the past but not in the present, were easily identifiable as the Belvedere Pavilion and the nearby Rocher Bridge. They had seen real people, she said, and only imagined them to be out of place or time, a trick of the memory after the notion occurred to them that they had witnessed a haunting. Or perhaps they had simply encountered people in masquerade, dressed up in historical apparel. Parapsychologist William F. Barrett of the Society wrote that same year in his book on psychical research, suggesting that the women may have been influenced by the parapsychology literature of the day, pointing out that the story of Helene Smith, a French medium who claimed to be a reincarnation of Marie Antoinette, had been highly publicized during the year before their tour of the palace. And while they were developing their book, the Society themselves had published about another medium that claimed to have been in communication with the last French queen throughout her life. Moberly and Jourdain, still anonymous, printed a revised edition in which they insisted they had not imagined the people they had seen, and that they could not have been historical reenactors because they confirmed there had been no quote-unquote historical fetes at the time of their visits. However, in a preface to yet another edition in 1924, the year Jourdain passed, they actually revealed that in their attempt to prove that there had been no people dressed in historical garb at Versailles during their visit, they discovered that there had been events and photo shoots with people in historical clothes on the grounds of Versailles all throughout that summer. Their evidence was that they had found evidence for people being on the grounds dressed historically throughout June and July, but not in early August, which I think anyone can recognize as rather strong evidence against their experience being supernatural. The palace was crawling with historical reenactors that summer. This back and forth continued over the next several decades between skeptics and the authors, as well as between skeptics and believers after the authors had both passed away. The release of their original accounts, said to have been written independently, was touted by believers, and when their identities as the heads of an Oxford college were finally revealed, it greatly increased fascination with and belief in the story. The first book-length treatment of the incident came in 1938 in J.R. Sturge Whiting's The Mystery of Versailles, in which he endorsed an explanation very similar to Eleanor Sidgwick's, that Moberly and Jourdain had simply gotten lost and misremembered known landmarks near the Trianon. In 1950, the Society for Psychical Research got the last word in when W.H. Salter, recently the Society's president, wrote a detailed report on the affair, alleging that Moberly and Jourdain had actually engaged in some academic misconduct by misrepresenting or tampering with their evidence in order to falsely embellish the support for their claims. He pointed out first the gap of time between their experience and their eyewitness accounts, suggesting their memory of the events may have been less than reliable, and he suggested that there was no proof that the two had in fact written them independently and not actually colluded in the composition of their experiences. As evidence, he pointed to their correspondence with the Society, which contained proof that the accounts they had released as their original 1901 writings may have been written as late as 1906, 5 years after their supposed experiences. And he remarked on the many additions to their claims that appeared with each revised edition of the book to suggest that their supposed true story was actually a fabrication that took shape over the course of more than 20 years. So, for example, later finding out that the door they'd heard being slammed hadn't actually been opened for years turns out to be far less convincing when it's shown they never mentioned the door until after confirming the sealed door's existence during a later visit. And Jourdain learning that the music she'd heard on her second visit was actually a song specific to the time of Marie Antoinette would be far more impressive if she had actually given some musical notation of the bars she'd heard before later identifying them. Essentially, new elements of their narrative appeared only when it was proven by their research to be confirmatory evidence, which is also what would happen if they were just ginning up new proofs for their claims. In 1957 came perhaps the most famous critical examination of the Moberly-Jourdain incident, with the publication of Ghosts of Versailles by Lucille Iremonger, a former student at St. Hugh's and, as fate would have it, a descendant of the Count of Vaudreuil, whom Moberly and Jourdain suggested they had encountered, and whom they depicted as a somewhat vile character. Perhaps driven by a genuine desire to explore their claims critically, or perhaps driven by some long-standing grudge against the women, or both, it was Iremonger that provided much of the most damaging information on the two, including their tendencies toward delusion, as I've detailed. Her book also engaged in salacious rumor-mongering, though, asserting that Moberly and Jourdain had been more than friends, that they had been lesbian partners, and to further impugn their character, she claimed that they had also had numerous affairs with the students under their charge through the years. Of course, some or all of this may very well have been true, It would not have been uncommon for women who never married, quote-unquote spinsters as they were often called at the time, who lived with female friends, to actually be lesbians unable to live openly. Such was also the case for quote-unquote confirmed bachelors of the era. But what makes Ironmonger's account really problematic is that she asserted their lesbianism was a sign of their unreliability, a sort of further indication of pathology to discredit them. It fed into 19th century stereotypes that women were more prone to delusion than men, and that lesbians, having no male check on their tendencies to insanity, were especially vulnerable to madness. This led to a very widespread interpretation of the Moberly-Jourdain incident as a folie à deux, a shared or contagious psychosis, or folly of two. In a somewhat backward way, we find a working explanation for the incident in this theory, disregarding claims about their sexuality and interpretations of their story as a Freudian allegory depicting a turning away from quote-unquote repulsive men toward a woman, Marie Antoinette, historically rumored to have had quote-unquote sapphic inclinations herself. The theory that Moberly and Jourdain were experiencing a folie à deux is worth entertaining. Typically in such cases, there is an individual more prone to mental illness and a person more dominant than the other, who can overcome doubts and cement belief. And often it involves the assembling of elaborate details as evidence for the delusion, which often revolves around some past event that's impossible to actually prove, all to allay any skepticism in their partner. This certainly sounds a lot like Moberly and Jourdain, although it seems Moberly's tendency to see people who weren't there started it, and then the paranoid Jourdain, the more dominant personality, took it and ran with it, identifying the vague ghosts her friend believed she had seen as historical figures and undertaking the research needed to convince not just Moberly, but the world of their shared delusion. In this way, their folie à deux may have been slightly different from other cases, with the more active proponent of the folly not being the partner more prone to delusion. Rather, she seems to have taken her partner's minor delusions and concocted with them the elaborate delusion that was shared with the world. Considering how many became convinced, it may be among the most contagious madnesses of all time. It is, however, also entirely plausible that Moberly had not been deluded at all, that she had just seen people in historical garb. Remember that the accounts of her later seeing medieval figures and crowds seemed to come only from Ironmonger, the rumor monger. And even if she did, maybe it was only because of the delusion Jourdain had convinced her to believe. For remember, there had been historical fetes at the palace that summer. This explanation that they had just seen people in costume had always been a favored explanation, ever since Eleanor Sidgwick's initial review of their book. And after Ironmonger's book, Dame Joan Evans, a historian of medieval art who had known both Moberly and Jourdain in her youth and had edited the 1955 edition of An Adventurer, offered an informative rebuttal. First, she chastised Ironmonger for her indiscretion in focusing on the esteemed women's sexuality and suggested her dim view of Moberly and Jourdain was, quote, less than generous, end quote, and essentially unwarranted. In her preface to the 1955 edition, she had previously written about other authors' theories that the women had simply been lost, were remembering known landmarks, and had simply seen costume play actors on the palace grounds. This explanation was far more appealing to her because it meant the women whom she admired had not been hoaxers or fabricators of evidence or promoters of a shared delusion, but had simply been mistaken. She found evidence for this far more generous view in a 1965 biography of famous artist and dandy Robert de Montesquieu. In that book, it was asserted that at the time of Moberly and Jourdain's visit, Montesquieu was living on the grounds at Versailles, spending a great deal of time at the Trianon. and was known to organize garden fêtes at which he and his friends dressed in historical clothes and created tableaux vivants, which you may remember was the precise word Jourdain used to describe things she had seen. In fact, Montesquieu's biographer believed that the description of the two men they encountered, the sinister pockmarked man and the gentleman who gave them directions, matched well with descriptions of Montesquieu and his lover. Dame Joan Evans, who held the copyright of An Adventure at the time, was so convinced by this explanation that she chose to never again produce a new edition of the work. What then are we to make of this fantastical story at the end of our analysis? It's an unusual case that defies any clear conclusions. Even those who would credit that Moberly and Jourdain experienced something supernatural cannot agree on what it was. Is the palace haunted? Did they travel through time? Is time unstuck there? Did they enter the mind and memory of the last Queen of France, as Jourdain had asserted? Or were the ladies in a sort of trance, making it more like a remote viewing, as more modern parapsychologists would understand it? Or was it all a hoax? If not a total fabrication, might they have been convinced of their experience, but fabricated evidence in their desire to prove the truth of their experience? Or perhaps they did not consciously fabricate or misrepresent evidence, but confirmation bias nevertheless skewed their research practices toward confirming their claims. More importantly, had their experience been a delusion, or had they simply mistaken what they saw? Was their memory of the kiosk and bridge flawed enough that they remembered it differently when they returned looking for the landmarks? Or were they so invested in their story by then that they simply convinced themselves that they had seen some other kiosk and bridge? Could they have seen typical gardeners or historical reenactors or the play-acting guests of Robert de Montesquieu in rehearsal for a tableau vivant? Or were they suffering a folie à deux? Why had they not seen the same things, the same people? Is it possible that when Moberly raised the idea of having seen ghosts, Jourdain simply pretended not to have seen the same figures in order to encourage the notion? She certainly was the driving force behind the formation of the elaborate story as it eventually came together. It was she who came up with the historical context of their story. She who claimed to have confirmed aspects of it through unnamed sources. She who took it upon herself to make return visits and conduct archival research. Knowing her intolerance of having her authority challenged at the college and her tendency to suspect plots against her, it's not unreasonable to suspect that it was she who made proving their experience a decade-long quest after the Society for Psychical Research dismissed their claims, and she who insisted on answering all their critics. In the end, there are many aspects of this mystery we will never be able to resolve, but as a rational skeptic, I can't accept claims of ghostly visitation or time travel on such unconvincing evidence. More convincing is the possibility that two women, lost at a tourist destination, happened upon some people in costume, later imagined something supernatural about it, and one of them, predisposed towards stubborn insistence on being right, made such a project of quote-unquote proving they'd seen something strange that it ended up convincing many readers. Rather than being a stain on her character, I rather think it's quite an achievement, though in creative literature, not science. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliette O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, Chris BDG, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, Brian, Jamie Nielsen, Martin Robistow, Josh Haberman, and AJ. I'd like to apologize again for my tardiness in getting books to partner patrons who haven't received them yet. If you message me on Patreon, I can just send you an ebook. I'm still trying to figure out why I'm unable to access my dashboard in my publishing platform, and I've just had very little time. I hope to have more time this summer to catch up on fulfillment and maybe sort out my transcript situation on the website as well, where I haven't been posting full scripts for about a year now. Bear with me. This first year as full-time faculty at my college has left me far less time to work on such things. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember the principle of parsimony or rule of economy, aka Occam's razor. It's not true in all cases that the best explanation is the simplest, but as Isaac Newton said, quote, "We are to admit no more causes of natural things than such as are both true and sufficient to explain their appearances," end quote. And certainly, there is no need to imagine time slippage and psychic journeys through the minds of historical figures to explain what Moberly and Jourdain described.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities, so do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Ever spend all day fishing and catch nothing? That's what happens to hackers when Cisco Duo's on watch. Every login, every device, every user, protected. Cisco Duo. Fishing season is over. Learn more at duo.com.